The first thing Daniel Carter noticed about the man was his hands. They were trembling, not violently, not enough for anyone else in the crowded cafe to notice, but just enough that Daniel, who had spent years reading people in boardrooms and crisis meetings, felt something tighten in his chest. The man stood near the counter, holding the hand of a small boy with dark curls and tired eyes. The boy clutched a toy car so tightly that the plastic creaked. Daniel Carter, CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech logistics companies in the country, was supposed to be thinking about numbers. Quarterly projections. A merger that could either double his company's valuation or sink it entirely. He had ducked into this cafe only because his driver was late and because, for once, he wanted to feel like a normal human being instead of a walking headline. But the man's hands wouldn't let him look away. The father, Daniel assumed he was the father, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His clothes were clean but worn, like they had been washed too many times. His jacket was zipped up even though the cafe was warm. The boy looked up at him, whispering something Daniel couldn't hear, and the man smiled quickly, a smile that appeared and vanished like a reflex rather than an emotion. Then it happened. The man glanced around the cafe, his eyes flicking to the windows, the door, the reflections in the glass. His gaze landed on Daniel for a fraction of a second, just long enough. And then, casually, almost invisibly, his left hand moved. Daniel froze. It wasn't random. It wasn't nervous fidgeting. It was deliberate. 3 fingers pressed briefly against the palm. A small rotation of the wrist. A pause. Daniel's breath caught. Help me. He hadn't seen that sign in over a decade. Not since a corporate volunteer initiative that partnered with advocacy groups for the deaf and vulnerable. Not since a training session he had almost skipped. Help me. I am in danger. Daniel's mind raced, but his face remained calm. Years of leadership had trained him for moments exactly like this, moments where panic could kill more than indecision ever would. The man looked away immediately, as if terrified he'd been noticed. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve again. "Daddy," he said softly. "Can we go home now?" Daniel didn't hear the man's reply, but he saw the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his jaw tightened. Something was very wrong. Daniel stood slowly, picking up his coffee as if nothing had happened. He took a step closer to the counter, positioning himself just behind the man and the child. The cafe buzzed with ordinary life, baristas calling out orders, laptops clicking open, the hiss of the espresso machine. No one else noticed the fear. Daniel leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice calm and unassuming. "I think you dropped this." He held out a napkin. The man turned, eyes wide for a split second before schooling his expression. Up close, Daniel could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. The man's pupils were dilated. Sweat beaded at his hairline. "Thank you," the man said, though there had been nothing to drop. Their fingers brushed. Daniel felt the man's hand shaking now, unmistakably. "I'm Daniel," he said quietly. "I can help you." The man swallowed. His lips parted, then closed again. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. Behind them, the cafe door opened. Daniel didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The air changed. Years of instinct screamed at him. Danger. The man stiffened like a wire pulled tight. "Daddy," the boy whispered. Daniel made a decision. He crouched down to the boy's level, smiling warmly. "Hey there. That's a cool car you've got." The boy's eyes lit up despite himself. "It's a police car." Daniel nodded. "Perfect. You know, police cars are really fast. They help people when they're in trouble." The man sucked in a sharp breath. Daniel stood back up, his voice lowering. "There's a back exit," he murmured, barely moving his lips. "Kitchen door. I'll distract them." The man's eyes filled with something dangerously close to tears. "I can't," he whispered. "They'll. Trust me," Daniel said. It wasn't a command. It was a promise. For a moment, the man hesitated, torn between fear and hope. Then his son squeezed his hand. "Daddy, I'm scared." That decided it. The man nodded once. Daniel straightened, turning just as 2 men stepped fully into the cafe. They didn't look like criminals. That was the problem. Clean cut. Confident. Eyes too sharp, scanning the room with calculated ease. Daniel smiled broadly and walked directly toward them. "Gentlemen," he said, extending his hand. Daniel Carter. Recognition flickered instantly. Of course it did. His face was everywhere: business magazines, interviews, keynote stages. One of the men shook his hand automatically. "Daniel Carter," he repeated. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Daniel replied lightly. "But here we are." Behind him, he heard the faint creak of a door opening. He kept talking. "You know," Daniel continued, clapping one man on the shoulder like an old friend, "I was just telling my assistant we should invest more in local businesses. Community matters, don't you think?" The man laughed, distracted. "Absolutely." The seconds stretched. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. Then, relief. The back door closed. Daniel released the man's shoulder and stepped back. "Well, I should get going. Meeting to save the world and all that." The two men nodded, still smiling, none the wiser. Daniel walked past them, out into the street, his heart hammering. He didn't stop walking until he reached the alley beside the café. The man and his son were there, pressed against the brick wall, breathing hard. The boy clung to his father, shaking. The man looked at Daniel like he was seeing a miracle. "I don't even know your name," the man said hoarsely. "Daniel," he replied again. "And you're safe. For now." The man laughed weakly, then covered his face with his hands. When he looked up, tears streaked down his cheeks. "My name is Michael," he said. "And this is my son, Ethan." Daniel crouched in front of Ethan. "You did great back there, buddy." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I held Daddy's hand like you said." Daniel stood, meeting Michael's eyes. "Who are they?" Michael hesitated, then spoke words that made Daniel's blood run cold. "They say I owe them," Michael said. "And they say the only way out is something I can't give." Daniel glanced down at Ethan, then back at Michael. "Then you're not getting out alone," Daniel said. And in that moment, standing in a narrow alley with a frightened single father and a child who deserved a better world, Daniel Carter realized this was no longer a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a fight he couldn't walk away from. If you want. Trust had become a luxury he could no longer afford, something he used to have back when his life was ordinary, when mornings meant burnt toast and rushing Ethan to school, when danger was limited to scraped knees and unpaid parking tickets. Now, trust was a risk that could cost him everything. Yet as he stood in that narrow alley, the brick wall cold against his back, watching his son cling to his leg, he realized he had already crossed that line the moment he made the sign. Daniel Carter didn't rush him. That alone felt strange. Most people, when they decided to help, tried to take control immediately. They asked questions too fast, offered solutions before understanding the problem. Daniel simply stood there, alert but calm, as if waiting for Michael's breathing to steady before anything else happened. "Are they gone?" Michael asked quietly. Daniel glanced toward the street, then nodded. "For now. But we shouldn't stay here." Michael looked down at Ethan. His son's face was pale, eyes wide and glossy with fear he was trying very hard to hide. Michael crouched, smoothing Ethan's hair with a hand that still shook. "Hey, buddy, remember what we talked about?" Deep breaths. Ethan nodded and inhaled exaggeratedly, then let it out. Michael copied him, forcing his own body to slow down. Daniel watched the interaction closely. He saw what others might miss, the way Michael positioned himself slightly in front of Ethan even now, the unconscious shielding, the way fear sharpened into something fierce whenever his son moved. This wasn't a man who had made reckless choices lightly. This was a man who had been cornered. "There's a parking garage 2 blocks down," Daniel said. "Private security. Cameras. We can talk there." Michael hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear, to never stay in one place longer than necessary. But his legs felt heavy, and Ethan's small fingers tightened in his jacket. "Okay," Michael said finally. They walked quickly but didn't run. Daniel kept pace with them, subtly positioning himself on the side closest to the street. Michael noticed. It was a small thing, but it told him everything. This man knew how to protect without making a show of it. Inside the garage, the air was cooler, quieter. Daniel led them to his car, a dark sedan that looked unremarkable except for its pristine condition. He opened the back door for Ethan. "Want to sit here?" Daniel asked. "It's safer." Ethan looked at his father. Michael nodded, lifting him into the seat and buckling him in with hands that finally steadied. The click of the seatbelt felt like a victory. Once they were inside, doors closed, the outside world muffled, Michael let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said again, voice rough. I don't know why you helped us. Daniel met his eyes through the rearview mirror. You asked for help. Most people don't. Michael gave a humorless laugh. I didn't exactly ask out loud. Daniel's expression softened. Sometimes the quiet ones are the loudest. For a moment, silence filled the car. The hum of the engine, the distant echo of footsteps in the garage. Ethan leaned his head against the window, exhaustion finally catching up to him. They weren't supposed to be there, Michael said suddenly. That cafe. I changed our routine. Daniel didn't interrupt. I used to work in finance, Michael continued. Compliance analysis. Nothing exciting, but I was good at it. Too good, apparently. Daniel's eyes flicked up. I found something I shouldn't have, Michael said. Transactions buried under layers of shell companies. Money moving in patterns that didn't make sense unless you knew what to look for. I reported it. Internally, at first. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. They told me to drop it, Michael said. Said I was mistaken. But then my wife, his voice broke, and he stopped, swallowing hard. She died 2 years ago. Car accident. And after that, everything was just easier for them. Ethan stirred at the mention, frowning in his sleep. Michael lowered his voice. They fired me. Quietly. Then the messages started. Calls at night. Men showing up where they shouldn't be. They said I had information that belonged to them. That if I cooperated, Ethan and I would be taken care of. And if you didn't? Daniel asked gently. Michael looked at his son. They didn't have to say it. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had seen versions of this story before, whistleblowers crushed under systems designed to protect themselves. But seeing it play out inches away, with a child asleep in the back seat, made it different. Personal. Why didn't you go to the police? Daniel asked. Michael shook his head immediately. I tried. The first time, the officer took notes and smiled too much. The second time, someone followed me home within the hour. After that, I understood. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Do you still have the information? He asked. Michael's lips pressed together. Yes. Multiple copies. Encrypted. They don't know where. Daniel nodded. That's why they haven't hurt you yet. Yet, Michael echoed. Daniel turned in his seat, facing them fully now. Michael, I'm not going to pretend I can fix this with a phone call. But I have resources. Lawyers who don't scare easily. Security teams who don't ask the wrong questions. And most importantly, visibility. Michael frowned. Visibility. They operate in the dark, Daniel said. People like me don't. If they touch you now, it won't disappear quietly. Michael studied him, searching for exaggeration, ego, anything that would make this feel unreal. But Daniel's confidence wasn't loud. It was measured, dangerous in its own way. You don't even know what you're stepping into, Michael said. Daniel smiled faintly. I've stepped into worse. Ethan shifted again, eyes fluttering open. Daddy, I'm here, Michael said instantly. Ethan looked around, confused. Are we in trouble? Daniel leaned forward slightly. No, buddy, you're safe. Ethan considered this, then nodded, trusting in a way only children could. He closed his eyes again within seconds. Michael felt something crack inside his chest. I don't want to be brave, he said quietly. I just want my son to grow up. Daniel met his gaze. Then let me help you make that happen. Outside, a car drove past the garage entrance, its headlights sweeping briefly across the concrete wall. Michael tensed automatically. Daniel noticed. You won't have to live like this anymore, he said. But it's going to get uncomfortable before it gets better. Michael let out a slow breath. Uncomfortable I can handle. Daniel started the car. Good. Because the moment you walked out of that cafe, everything changed. As they pulled out of the garage and merged into traffic, Michael watched the city slide by, feeling something unfamiliar stir beneath the fear. Hope. And somewhere, far behind them, unseen eyes began to realize that the single father they had been hunting was no longer alone.